Everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the first public program that we're offering to accompany our new exhibition, Decade of Discovery, Clyfford Still in Denver. My name is Nicole Cromartie, and I'm the Director of Education and Programs here at the Clyfford Still Museum. Tonight, we are thrilled to have our conservators, James Squires and Michael Mikesell, joining us here tonight to share some of their insights on what it's like to be responsible for the art collection here at the museum. We are really pleased to have a live audience here at the museum tonight. It's so amazing to see some of your faces, but we're also simulcasting to YouTube. So we do have an online audience as well, which is really exciting. We learned a lot about online programming, as you might imagine, over the past couple of years, and we really think that we're going to continue to offer online versions of our in-person program. So following the presentation tonight, James and Michael will be able to take questions from all of you, which is always makes for a lively conversation with these two. I'm very excited.
Just between the two of us.
Yes, exactly. So James Squires is our chief conservator here at the Clyfford Still Museum. He first began conservation work on the museum's collection in 2010 as the associate conservator of paintings for the Clyfford Still Museum and the Denver Art Museum. From 2001 to 2010, James co-managed the Atlanta Art Conservation Center, a satellite regional conservation laboratory of the Williamstown Art Conservation Center. Along with treating a variety of paintings, James has lectured about conservation and promoted heritage preservation efforts throughout the Southeast. Michael Mikesell, who's hiding behind me, is Associate Conservator of Paper at CSM, has developed more in-depth preservation practices to facilitate the long-term care of paper objects in the Clyfford Still Museum's collections since joining our staff in 2017. She has ongoing research into papers still used and the light-sensitive materials within the collections, which will inform future conservation treatment protocols. Michael has worked previously with the collections at the Denver Art Museum, Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. She earned her Master's of Art with a Certificate of Advanced Study in Art Conservation from SUNY Buffalo State. And now, let's offer James and Michael a warm welcome.
I first wanted to start and call a shout out to all of those people over the past 10 years who have knocked on my door, and then I had come to the door and subsequently asked me, "What are you doing in there?" So hopefully this talk will be an opportunity to reveal some of the mysteries behind the curtain, so to speak. That said, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you all online for spending some time with us this evening. The background image you see on the screen right now is actually from a still image from a video that was cast on the south wall of the museum in 2011 during the museum's inaugural celebration called First Light. I love the video. It's a just wonderful video, but what it really reveals sort of the bottom of the building, as you can see, it sort of appears normal. With the unique textured concrete and winged facade. The top reveals an image of people walking through the galleries as if the upper wall was removed, exposing all of the art within. The peek in, the anticipation of the new, the previously unseen, embodies the excitement and enthusiasm of those early years. That same enthusiasm was felt within the collections and conservation departments as we unrolled the paintings or opened up Still's original Solander boxes full of works of art on paper for the first time. As we continued these activities over the years, the realization of our roles as stewards of the collection became more fully understood. In this talk, we'll discuss the evolution of the collection from a conservation perspective, highlighting some discoveries and the challenges associated with an art collection that's never been seen before. In this talk, we will review literally the discovery of the collection, the museum's initial thoughts on treatment and its associated challenges, and where we are today. We'll end with what we'd like to achieve over the next 10 years. But first, we'll start with a bit more about us and our history with the collection. There we go.
So I do have actually a bit of a unique history with the museum. In a way, I have been here since the beginning. I was an intern at the Denver Art Museum when the inaugural works on paper came over for treatment before they came actually to this museum. So back in my way back beginning, Clyfford Still Museum and I crossed paths. From 2012 to 2016, I continued to house roughly 1,700 works on paper and carried out remedial treatments occasionally in more of a contractual capacity here for the museum. During this time, I also earned my master's and certificate in conservation, specializing in the paper-based artworks. And in this moment, Still's work was kind of always floating around in my mind, just thinking about, what were we actually looking at? What would happen to the collection as it continued to age? What was the potential impact of, accessing, of viewing these objects? And, I even spent a little bit of my study time actually trying to conduct dye analysis on construction papers while I had access to analytical equipment in school. So it was just a constant presence in my life. And that meant by the time I came on board full-time in 2017, I'd pretty much seen every work of art on paper, and I was definitely invested as a caretaker and physical interpreter for this collection. So this is actually a very old image of me now, when I was in the process of housing those works on paper initially. I have been startled out of my very, very intense work reverie. So yeah, this was from the image vault that we came across while trying to review the last 10 years.
Oh, how times have changed. That was me, again, in the earlier years. No gray hair at that point. I'm in the conservation lab actually stretching some of the paintings. One's behind me, of course, and the other is on the table, and I'm starting the stapling process. As Nicole mentioned in her introduction, my first role was a shared position between the two institutions, the Denver Art Museum and the Clyfford Still Museum. It was and continues to be a grant-funded position, ensuring that the Clyfford Still Museum fulfills one of its core requirements of having a trained conservator on staff, per the will. Pam Skiles, the senior paintings conservator at the Dam, now fulfills that role, and she's over here part-time, as many of you know. Soon after I began in 2010, I traveled with Dean Sobel, the museum's first director, to the suburban Washington, D.C. Art storage facility to begin assessing the collection for the opening, which at that point was about 18 months away. It was both an amazing and daunting to see all of Still's, say, 840-ish paintings that we have in our collection rolled onto 231 rolls standing vertically in all of these racks. It was really exciting to see these in different states of repair and sort of the wonderment that that was inside these tubes. You just had no idea. Anyway, after that, I moved to the museum full time in October in 2013, post the opening. What do we have here? So we'll try to do a brief conservation history here. The image on the screen is of Dean Sobel in the orange shirt there, and adjacent to him is David Anfam, who was the adjunct curator at the time. And we are at the storage vault in 2010 looking at two paintings by Still. One, of course, is one of his many sets of duplicates that he had created. I recall a moment assessing two paintings with David Anfam, who I had just recently met. David, as you may or may not know, wrote his PhD thesis on Still and also met the artist at his last solo exhibition at the Met in 1979. David remembered seeing the first picture in our discussion at the Met show and commented that its condition looked really good. I was like, okay. To my eye, the surface sheen was uneven and there were cotton linters embedded in the surface. It's like, okay, if that's what good looks like for him, that's fine. The other canvas painted within 2 years of the first possessed similar issues. David speculated the picture was simply a mess. I have to admit I agreed, but like I suggested earlier, I thought the first one was a mess as well. So it really begged the question of what are these pictures supposed to look like? Though one could argue David's response was really arbitrary, instead it really brought home to me the fact that no one knew or knows really what these pictures look like upon completion. Part of our job as conservators, curators, and scholars was not just to understand how they originally looked, but, as I realized soon after the experience, but begin to define what an aged Clyfford Still painting is supposed to look like. As we've learned over the years, even Still seemed to change his mind on that topic. Well, the image on the screen are two images. Myself on the left with former registrar and collections manager Emily Kozakowski. We're unrolling one of the large paintings from one of the tubes in the conservation lab. And the image on the right is one of the research lab where the works of art on paper are housed, and a number of those works are laid out on the tables before they've been appropriately conserved, hinged, and housed. In the pre-opening moment, however, I did not have the luxury to ponder what this actually meant in terms of what Clyfford Still paintings are supposed to look like. I and the other conservators working on the collection had an opening deadline to meet. Some works were treated by the conservators at Artex, where the works were stored, and then in 2011, the first paintings were shipped to the Denver Art Museum's Conservation Department, where I undertook most of the treatments. I also oversaw the work of some local conservators working together to make sure everything was ready for the inaugural.
And just to bring paper in, it's always right there. The works on paper for the opening exhibition and actually the first rotation, so not just the inaugural show, but the subsequent set that were planned for exhibition, were assessed and prepared by Sarah Melching, the paper conservator and head of conservation at the Denver Art Museum. I assisted as an intern. So in addition to that preparation, she kind of worked with Dean Sobel and some of the other early collections members here to kind of establish the first practices around long-term care of the works and proper housing and access and display protocols. And she, several of the works underwent a little more interventive treatments to address some of the most obvious concerns. The works that were selected for the inaugural show happened to be some of Still's personally preferred works, so they had an existing display history and subsequent damages and degradation corresponding to that. So that was taken care of kind of right out of the gate.
Okay. So we survived the opening. It was really a lot of fun. Just as an aside, it was a lot of fun. As Dean Sobel said shortly after the opening, and or still living in that afterglow, so to speak, is that he said once the museum was open, the real work actually begins. And that's actually really true. During 2012, the remainder of the collection was transported from suburban Washington, D.C. and finally got here to its new home at the Clyfford Still Museum. From a collections perspective, our focus really at that point became all about access, because that's part of what the will is as well, as around accessing all these pieces. The conservation team worked with the other collection team members to first document and inventory all of these works. Being a new museum, we really had to start from the ground up. And what that meant is that we even had to come up with a numbering system for everything. It is at that point, for example, where the PH number that you see on all the works actually became the work's title. For those that are not aware, the PH actually is the PH designation or nomenclature was originated by the Stills, and it was part of their inventory structure when they inventoried the collection in the 60s. And also during this inventory process, we also discovered works both on the paper and painting side that were not part of that original Still inventory. And those we chose at that point to give the PHX or the X designation. It could be PHX, PPX, depending on the material. But that's how those works got their titles, is that we had to start somewhere. And goodness knows none of the works had titles. So that's how the titles became what they are within the collection. As we were continuing this inventory process, I was basically starting to stretch some of the works. It was decided that I would start with the earlier works, and fortunately many of the earlier works were many of the smaller works, so we could really get through a lot of those. That said, the works were in generally good condition, much to, I think, many people's surprise. So treatments were really, were minimal. We didn't have to do a lot from a treatment perspective with these works, thankfully. Meanwhile, with Michael's work on the paper side, as it was getting cataloged, they were also getting hinged and matted for preservation matting purposes so we could store them safely.
Yeah.
The slide on here is the opening gallery from the conservation show, entitled The Art of Conservation. As you might imagine, the breadth and depth of our collection basically virtually provides examples of every material and aesthetic issue associated with Clyfford Still's artworks. And as we were discovering these works in 2014, Dean invited me to curate a show. And so in 2014, the museum sought to share all of these discoveries to date with the general public, presenting them in a new way via this exhibition. I mean, I have to admit, it was an opportunity to present the collection as we received it in its current condition. And and we used that as a launching point for a broader conversations around materials, condition, history, interpretation, treatment, and even connoisseurship. I mean, I remember those moments and be walking in Dean's office or walking through the halls and looking at what I'm doing and feeling like I'm airing the museum's dirty laundry, so to speak, because nothing was complete. I mean, basically every picture represented a conundrum of some sort. And that was the point. It was, these are the issues and around treatment and interpretation. Some of those issues that we highlighted are in these are exemplified in these three paintings on the screen here. The first is PH 1142 from 1957. It's a vertically oriented picture with a central red form, a black form in the upper left, and an orange form in the upper right. What is common, some of the common issues with Still's pictures, as some of you may know, is that because the paint is not dry in many cases, we often have media transfer to the bare canvas forms. And you can see that bare canvas, hitting this correct, I lost it. You got to trust me. To the left of the form, to the left, thank you, Michael. To the left of the red form, you can see some of the red paint transfer. More significantly, though, which was probably the most surprising discovery with this picture, was the black corrosion material that you can see crossing the orange form passage there. No one had ever seen that before, and we had no idea what it was. We've subsequently done some work on it and gotten some analysis done on it. But it was quite surprising. And we see it in a lot of those oranges as well as some of the whites that he used. PH 216 from 1955 is a predominantly black picture with a vertical yellow line with a blue form in the left corner, bottom corner, and a red form in the upper right corner. It exemplifies other issues, money associated with rolling and then still oiling out the surface. The first is you can see the little tabs, about the 6 to 8 tabs on the left side are all remnants of tape that he used to roll the pictures up. We could remove the tape body, the paper part of the tape, but the adhesive residues remained, and because of the solubility of the surface, and it being very sensitive, they're very difficult to remove. So that was always a problem. The oiling out of the surface has since darkened and dulled irregularly on the surface, and it also has darkened the two yellowed forms along the top edge. Those are actually passages of bare canvas. So that I don't think originally, when it was completed, were intended to be that yellow. It's just the yellowing of the oil media that he used to apply to the surface. And then, of course, I think what I'm probably known for more than anything is the existence of fatty acid bloom and metal soaps that are exhibited in the passage of red paint in the upper right corner. That passage of paint, of course, is supposed to be a much deeper red tone. Instead, it has like a white film over the top of it, and that's just a function of the paint drying and depositing itself on the surface. The third image is PH 1053 from 1950. It's a square canvas, basically a bare canvas with a small orange passage in the middle as well as a blue passage in the lower right corner. I'm not sure if you can see it from your angle, but basically there's dark halos around the two painted passages which is basically oil media bleed because Still mixed his own paints. Excess of oil had to go somewhere. It migrated into the canvas fibers and migrated outward to dry. And so what's interesting is that that's obviously an aesthetic problem that we have with the work, but what's also doubly interesting is Still saw this and he responded to it by painting titanium or dabbing titanium white pigment on top of the discolored areas, which looks equally as bad, honestly, as the dark haloing itself. So it really asks questions not just about how do we resolve the media bleed question, but also how do we address Still's response, to the picture, because clearly that wasn't as intended as well. So these are some of the ideas and some of the highlights from the collection. I also need to say, though, that though I'm highlighting paintings in this, many of the works of art on paper had some similar issues as well as some other, come on now.
Yeah, we have lateral bleed all over the place as well, and Still makes corrections in the works on paper, believe it or not. Yep.
There we go.
Overpaint corrections, yeah.
All right. So also that year, we hosted what was called the Conservation Summit, where we invited a number of conservators and scholars and conservation scientists with knowledge of abstract expressionism and the materials those artists used to the museum, who we looked closely at the works in many different ways to begin to develop ways of interpreting the pictures. From this, we identified potential topics needing further technical and art historical research. The image on the left is the huddled masses of sorts in the conservation lab, some sitting at the table looking at some of the pictures and closely at the pictures and some of the issues that are associated with their condition. That picture, PH 1125, the yellow with the red line, red mark in it, basically came to the lab or to the museum covered in wax paper, and it's subsequently been removed, and the surface has been dramatically damaged because of that, and so that's what they're looking at there. From that experience spawned a more broadly accessible format to share the information. We partnered with the Getty Conservation Institute that year, co-hosting a symposium in Los Angeles to further discuss some of these issues. And the two images on the right are in the center rather, is Dr. Narayan Kandahar, who is the head of the Strauss Center at Harvard. And what he was talking about at the symposium was the Seagram murals that were badly faded and how the Strauss basically used light to restore these works. They basically used light to in-paint the colors back in a controlled environment in the galleries. The now gray canvases, they projected light on it in a very precise way in order to recreate what they looked like originally. It was a really amazing talk and demonstration. It was sort of a paradigm shift for us in the conservation field to see what the potential was with some of this technology. So it was really cool to have him there.
Totally new tools.
We also continued, from that also, we continued the partnership with the Getty Conservation Institute, and they were the ones who were able to identify, or we would do some more additional technical analysis with them, and they were the ones who identified lead oxide as the formation of that black formation on the orange paint, for example.
Right, so kind of to continue looking in this post-opening timeframe in the works on paper, and though the world Still included categorizes Still as a painter, we kind of need to keep in mind that the majority of our artworks in this collection are actually drawings on paper. And since you're just kind of smacked with the sheer volume right out of the gate, and then you kind of dive in. So kind of since my arrival as a full-time staff member, I've been able to understand the works on paper collection, including all the previous conservation efforts, like kind of start to bring everything together and create a more holistic view and understanding. I understand material sensitivities a lot better. It's not just a large statement, but we can start to drill it in. The predominant condition issues and the subtle shifts, that are emerging in the materials as the works no longer remain in these dense stacks away from light and environmental stimuli. So in this slide on the left, yes, it's me. I spent years housing this collection. So again, we have a picture of me housing works on paper. But on the right is an early image during those very first days of cataloging and inventorying of how the works on paper arrived into this institution from those shipments. though that's a single box of works on paper, there's 100 to 150 works in that box. They are single stacked, interleaved with a single sheet of glassine paper. They're dense. They're constrained into these exact fitting size boxes with some interleaving materials so they don't shift drastically. This is a restrained storage system. These works aren't allowed to shift. They're not allowed to move around and respond to environmental stimuli. So when we take them out of this environment and put them into this one, it's like it's a little extra level of freedom. They start to respond, they start to move, they start to shift. And we've really seen that happen over the last 10 years for sure. So it's a really cool thing to watch in real time. Sorry, I know I get sidetracked. Part of this comes in conjunction with like initial egress and conversations, like more esoteric discussions into our roles as conservators. You know, we actually have two collections here. We have the artworks and we have the archives. And as a paper conservator, I'm in both worlds. I straddle that fence pretty well. It's all paper land. We're happy. But still has examples of his hand, of his output that exists in the archives collection. He didn't catalog it into his artwork collection. So we're dealing with these conundrums of, is it an artwork? Is it an archived object? We're kind of looking at, does the aesthetic of this work read as unhindered? Can we accept this aesthetic? Should we accept this aesthetic? Should we do something about it? Also, what level of importance does Patricia Still's decisions around the collection while in her care matter to us in our modern context? We aren't the first caretakers for this collection. Others have been very invested as well. And they've had a hand and an impact, and we have to acknowledge that. How do we incorporate that and continue to move forward? And kind of another thing that really comes to my mind is, how do we preserve such information? You know, how do we note the changes? How do we, you know, say, yes, we've done this, but now our approach is going to be this? So this is all kind of going on as we're like actually doing physical work. And lastly, specifically to the works on paper, one of the more significant realizations has been the subset of the drawings in oil pastel and construction paper, which comprises about 42% of all the artwork objects in this collection. So it's a staggering percentage. It's a lot. This unique body of work possesses some considerable challenges to not only potentially treating them, if ever possible, but also even preserving them for much further into the future. They're really fugitive materials.
So while conservation and the inventory process allowed the conservation team to gain a more, I would say, nuanced understanding of the breadth and scope of the condition issues that we see that are within the collection. It also revealed that many of the artworks, interestingly enough, are in actually very good, if not pristine condition, though they were often made of fragile or fugitive materials, much like the construction paper pieces Michael just described. Laying eyes on the entirety of the collections and witnessing their condition allows us as conservators to envision, along with our curatorial colleagues, what an aged Clyfford Still probably should look like. The like-new works provide a baseline to understanding the physical changes we're seeing in the damaged works, as well as providing some insight into Clyfford Still's original intent. It was understood early on that many of those treatment-related issues, like those highlighted in the conservation show I mentioned earlier, demanded technical research to better understand the changes that we were seeing and more time to develop effective sort of treatment solutions. Research projects, again, with the Getty Conservation Institute as well as the Metropolitan Museum of Art are underway to help us better understand how to move forward, but we have not yet really been able to develop any truly effective sort of treatment protocols for those issues like the fatty acid bloom or the corrosion/lead oxide formation on those orange paints. So meanwhile, understanding that that type of work is going to be taking some time, as stewards of the collection, we knew that we needed to do more to preserve these collections, ensuring that those works that are in like-new condition right now remain in that state while buying us some time for research for some long-term solutions. our energies became more focused on developing effective preservation guidelines and strategies while continuing to undertake those remedial treatments like we both described earlier. The image on the slide sort of embodies where the works of art on paper moved to. This was the conservation sort of hinging and matting and storage of all of these works, so they can be easily handled, and then when needed for exhibition, they can be pulled out and put into frames and whatnot, but minimal handling at this point. Some of them do have conservation-related issues, but they're structurally stable enough to be housed and stored in this way. And of course, this is where we're at right now with the storage of the paintings, is that, as I was stretching them, they were getting put on the racks in an organized way, as well as those paintings that we have not been able to stretch yet, were taken off of those narrow diameter rolls that's still used, and we put them on 10-inch diameter sonotubes that you can see now that lay horizontally along the back wall or hang horizontally along the back wall.
This is where we're at now. Our preservation kind of straddles into our history, but it's going to push forward. It will continue to be a focus. So while conservation and more broadly CSM collections departments has initiated several specific projects focusing on preservation, and we'll talk about those. We're going to deep dive. First, I'd like to highlight an aspect of conservation work which is seldom brought to a more public focus, and that is all of our documentation. So in this slide, as you see on the left, a nice handy stack of paperwork and files and binders. We document everything we do, and we keep all of that. And oftentimes, it looks like these stacks of hard to interpret, hard to understand paperwork. One of the fortunate things that we've been able to do here is translate kind of this archaic system into a more modern digital repository associated in our collections management system, the databases that we maintain relating to all the artworks and collections objects here. So all of these little bits of data, and they're vitally linked to the artwork itself. We're aggregating and we're collecting. Conservation documentation is part of the preservation and the history of the object, since inevitably conservators have to interact with the art. That's a nature of our work. So this becomes a portion that requires preservation along with the artwork itself. This complete historical narrative provides such a foundation, a supportive foundation for any future decisions around the care of the object. So we like to keep it in good order. This is where we hit a bit of a snag. This is a lot of documentation. This data, and over the years at CSM, it has become dissociated. When we had old paperwork files, they got set here. Somebody borrowed them to read them. They got set here. So we are facing a pretty substantial amount of data dissociation. This isn't an uncommon problem for conservators, but since we've been the first institutional home for this body of work, we wanted to ensure the preservation of the conservation narrative along with the artworks. Since 2018, CSM conservators and assistant, we are supported by collections team broadly, we have systematized and standardized all the conservation records to create an aggregated digital repository, which formally relates to the greater collections management system and those roles accessing it. So those roles would be curatorial, maybe education, programming, archives even, those people that want access to this information. All this is to say, we've collected a lot of conservation activity reports, their auxiliary information, and we're cleaning them up so they look even as pretty as the artworks themselves. Okay, so some of those specific preservation projects. In 2017, conservation realized that we had a rare opportunity to document and track to a much greater degree how much we are exposing our collections to light, one of the more significant contributors to material degradation. with this new infrastructure, this database that we had access to for collections management, I set up the exposure tracking system, what we call the ETS. With this pulling information from the exhibition node, so our history of our exhibitions, the object record node, all of the information about the artwork and its provenance and size and that kind of stuff. Conservation records, because we assign sensitivity values in our reporting, with measurements from our galleries and some behind-the-scenes calculations, that we spit out a nice little handy flag that allows us to track how much light exposure each work tends to receive while on view. I don't have to do hand calculations. It's a beautiful system. This lets us caretakers know an annual average of exposure and whether or not an artwork has reached an overexposure threshold. I love this tool. It is an amazing tool. It provides, at a quick glance, a lot of information for the collections team and curators in balancing programming and access exposure with that really strictest sense of preservation, meaning when you leave an artwork or a collected object in storage and never access it.
One thing to say about this, it seems sort of common sense, but nobody has this. This tool is not in any, it's not a standard tool in any database that you can purchase.
Yeah.
You know, so it was something that Michael was able to design, and I think it's been a great tool for us. And I think for the curators to quickly go through and identify works that need rest, so to speak. I hate to anthropomorphize, of course, but.
Yeah, so basically that large view just says each object record lists the exposure status as exhibitable or recommended for storage. So it's a quick toggle. It gives you a good overview. Another preservation project is super nerdy, colorimetry. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Colorimetry is the measurement of color. It's the assignment of what we see, green, red, yellow, to a numeric value and mapped in a color space in 3 dimensions. So this is one interpretation of that color space. There are several ways to interpret it. People visually illustrate it in different ways. But you're basically looking at white to dark on the vertical axis and then the chroma or the color moving around equatorially in different cross axes. So we use colorimetric measurements to read in real time the color available in the artworks. We do regular repeat measurements to see if there's any shifts. And this instrumentation is sensitive that it notices shifts before the human eye can detect them. So we have a head start if anything is happening before we see visual damage in the artwork.
Yeah, the motivation for this was the fact that as we were inventorying these collections and of course discovering these very fugitive construction paper pieces, and of course they were going to go on view and we want them to go on view. But we also knew that they were very sensitive, and we also know that that change is, to the human eye, can take time and is a very slow change. So with that, the idea of colorimetry is that we can measure in a moment and calculate, measure where it exists in a 3-dimensional color space and measure it again and demonstrate that the measurement in that same spot has moved. So it has indeed changed in some way. Not necessarily good or bad. We're not passing judgment on that, but just acknowledging the fact that chemical reactions are occurring while these works are on view.
And this is long-term, guys. This is like a 20 to 50-year project. This isn't going to be happening overnight. So we're in it for the long haul. These are our real-time measurements. We're going to keep tracking it. In conjunction, or I'm sorry, I should explain. This is a sample set that we did, and you can see in the central image, there are 3 sets of construction paper, not stills, that were packaged, created the same, and then put through 3 separate exposure scenarios. And then I'm taking the measurements afterwards using that colorimetry measurement device to know, what we actually got at the other end. And yes, we burned the one sample pretty good. We don't ever want to do that with VR. So in conjunction with colorimetry, we're also going to be undertaking what's called microfade testing. It's not a complementary. It's a loosely associated technique. It kind of relies on the same color space mapping and the same way to discuss color and measure color and that kind of understanding. But it's a predictive technique. So it kind of bombards a very small sample set with intense light and does those repeat measurements very quickly, once a second, until you get an extrapolated curve of how that material would respond to light over time. So I am doing some initial tests with an artwork over there, over in the right-hand image. We'll use this to get predictive measurements for all of our collections material. And hopefully, it'll give us good results and we can modify that exposure tracking system, dial it in, so that if we know if something's extra specially sensitive, we can dial back those requirements and just kind of keep everything in a nice balance going forward.
And conversely, if we realize works that are less sensitive than what we thought they were,
yes,
we can expand that exposure time as well, or access time.
Yeah. Yep. So this will continue. These are clearly not something we're going to get done in the next couple months, years, et cetera. But in the next 10 years, as we continue this work, the power of the colorimetric combined with the MFT data will start to show, because conservators know that predictive data never actually reflects what's going on in real-time scenarios. You can't account for all the variables. A daylight gallery as opposed to a controlled lighting gallery, just the change in that set of variables and what you would have to track is too great. So what we're hoping is that 20 years from now, we'll have a solid set of colorimetry data that we can compare to our MFT, and we can know exactly how accurate that prediction was, or how far it diverges. Also, this kind of comparison study isn't broadly available, so we would like and we would hope that we can give this information back to the larger conservation science community. At least this is a goal. It is a strong desire, #goal. And these kind of avenues really do cap our preservation, our actionable items right now. But we do hope to begin several research projects into the materials in our collection. And ultimately, we hope that those material research projects that we're developing will yield treatment, actual treatment pathways. So. Okay, so those potential future research projects, we've only begun to identify and explore what these could be, any of these opportunities. We know that further research into some of the existing conditions, issues that we've already identified are necessary. Lateral bleed, media bleed, this is a work on paper actually. So Squires showed you images of paintings with the lateral bleed, and this is the counterpart in the paper collection. We're observing changes which have already occurred in stills artworks, and this gives us a strong idea of our pristine works will be heading in the future. We have things that are in really good condition, but we all have things that are showing their age. And we want to get a good idea of how all the stills look. So one of our goals is to conduct a survey of stills artwork not in our collection. We assume within some range that these works would have potentially greater exposure or have been moved around more if they've been sold between different collectors, or even held in less than ideal conditions. So understanding that range has become a serious goal for us. Another potential future research project would be assessing analysis methods that could be applicable to the characterization of construction paper dyes. This grouping on the right side of this slide are all oil pastel drawings on black construction paper. And I'm not sure if it'll come through on a different screen, but PP 334 in 1951 is on kind of a neutral black construction paper. PP 84 from 1959 on the right-hand side, the construction paper is shifting to more of a greenish hue in that black dye. And PP31 from 1965 at the bottom, that black dye, that paper is shifting to more of a red hue. They are produced at different times, and we do know that they would not be necessarily the same dye component in the paper substrate, but understanding some of those chemistries and how they could potentially change would be a really good thing for us to know in this collection.
So, you know, we've been talking a lot more around the preservation side of these things and some of the science of that stuff, but we haven't forgotten about treatment. We do take the treatment side of it very seriously. We're very excited to engage in treatments. But right now, we take it very seriously, but what we're in the process of doing right now really is defining what is appropriate in terms of treatment for both in terms of materials and aesthetic. Again, going back to these questions around what an aged Clifford still is supposed to look like and what can we do with the aged materials to try to get it to that point. We really, and so that in this process, we really must diligently understand our options and potential impact, because so many other folks out there in the larger arts community with holdings of Clifford Stoll artworks have sought our input already. I mean, for example, I've consulted with the Albright Knox in Buffalo around their collection, as well as consulting with Guggenheim Bilbao when I was out there in 2016 for the Abstract Expressionism show. So these are questions that are out there, so to speak, in the ether, and I think people have really been waiting for us to begin to develop some of these sort of treatment methodologies. And again, right now we're in the process of wanting to develop some of these protocols around some of these, around issues that are specific to aging Clifford Still pictures. Michael has highlighted two of those already in the previous slides as it pertained to the media bleed that you saw, the oil media bleed, as well as the color shifts of the construction paper works. And then, of course, the other essential questions around that is acceptable change and fading, or do those works at some point, because they are so fugitive, just basically die, to use that phrase. You know, they no longer represent the work to a degree that they just can't be exhibited anymore. So there's some interesting philosophical questions that we're all still trying to work out around those. In this case, we have some of the other issues that we still want to continue to work on. Again, fatty acid bloom, metal soaps that you can see in pH 8, 1952. On the right side, it's basically a large blue form, sort of outlined in black with a red form above it. And the blue form, again, all the white is multiple forms of fatty acid soaps with different metal ions associated with the fatty acid chain that cause different sort of optical as well as treatment-related challenges, because depending on the metal ion, the solubility will vary, and given the fact that the materials underneath continue to be soluble, it becomes very challenging to try to remove some of these. In pH 247, with Big Blue, as we all know, the museum's favorite, I think. The white that you see, the whitening that you see in Big Blue, as many of you probably know, because you've heard me talk about this before, is actually a chemical change that the paint is undergoing, where what is happening is the oil media itself is physically separating from the pigment particles, creating air pockets in between the two. So as light passes through, it goes into that air pocket, refracts, and then comes back as white light and appears white optically on the surface of the picture. So these are issues that we see this sort of blanching effect in both forms on other pictures throughout the collection, as well as the decolorization of, say, the turkey red, the famous turkey red of pH 389. And so more research needs to go into those in order to develop more effective sort of treatment protocols around those pieces. To end, first off, thank you. We'll start again. This is another image from that projection from the inaugural First Light. And of course, it was Still's famous phrase, "You can turn the lights out, the paintings will carry their own fire." The irony is not lost on us from a preservation perspective.
We like the lights out.
As conservators and museum professionals, we're all caretakers to this collection. Our first 10 years confirm much we already know about Still's artwork, while revealing much we still don't fully understand. As we prepare for the next 10 years, conservation at the Clifford Still Museum is planning significant research projects in order to take our collection care efforts to the next level. We recognize that we are not an insular institution, and we need resources from outside. We are also committed to sharing all of this materials and knowledge and develop treatment options with others in the broader conservation and preservation communities. The collection offers a true treasure trove of information, and we're really excited because we believe that we're going to really be discovering a lot over the next 10 years and beyond. So thank you.
And we have some time to take some questions if anyone in the audience. Oh yeah, we already have a couple right here in the front.
Concerning the light hazard, exposing light to works of art, particularly works on paper, I would imagine. Does a work on paper, Degas pastel, for example, just simply get worse and worse and worse and worse until it becomes a non-piece of art? Or if it gets into storage for 10 years, does it recover somewhat?
It depends.
Well-
With any work of art, it depends on the materials present. If you're talking about a Degas pastel drawing, you have a chalk pastel that has a colorant in a binder applied to a paper substrate, may or may not be fixed. A lot of Degas are not fixed. Clifford Still did apply fixative to a lot of his oil pastels. So it depends on the specific system. In some instances, some degradation pathways can be reversible if they're taken off view. Most of them, not so much. We tend to look at it as like an excitation energy. If you have a battery and you charge it and charge it and charge it, and then it's stored and you can use it, that's kind of what's happening with light exposure into the artworks. If you don't fully charge it, if you don't expose it for a prolonged period, it won't really, you don't as quickly kick off those degradation processes. So it's a balancing act. It's the amount of energy you're exposing it to, the amount of light, the intensity of light, coupled with the length of time you're putting something on view. I think in the back you had your hand? Yeah.
This could be as long as you want to make it or short. Could Clifford have done anything to help his paintings last longer, or is this just something that happens because of the time or just his style of painting?
The question is whether Clifford Still could be more proactive in the preservation of his artworks, and based primarily on materials. How to answer? Yeah, yes and no. I mean, Clifford Still considered himself a very traditional artist, as you know, and honestly, he was in comparison to a lot of his peers because he basically worked fundamentally in oil and traditional artist materials.
Except construction papers.
Well, yes, in the painting side of it. But yeah, so where he diverged, of course, was that he was not just dealing with old mineral pigments. He was also dealing with modern pigments. One of the most, from my perspective, one of the more interesting phenomena that occurred in the mid-20th century was the development of a lot of these inorganic pigments and new dye stuffs that were being used by industry and the art industry to make paints and create a greater range of colors for artists. So in that sense, though he's using traditional materials, he's using new materials in a traditional way that are untested. So, and did he know what Turkey red was? No. Which was basically a dye stuff that mimicked alizarin, which is in itself is very fugitive. He was looking, I'm sure as an artist, as many artists are, they're looking at the colors and they're looking at the properties and the working properties of those materials and liking those. And then, of course, looking at cost, And so, yeah, it would have been great if he would have had the foresight to say, yeah, I'm just not sure about the light fastness of this, But, that's our problem. That's for us to try to solve. And sometimes it can be a little bit of a slow process. I want to celebrate his creative process using these materials just as much as, poo-pooing him for using these materials.
He did have a good concept of preservation, even in his own lifetime. He was very diligent in educating about available conservation practices, even let alone preservation. Like his collection, and his family did a very good job of taking steps for strict preservation. Yeah.
But that said, he also never thought he did anything wrong. I mean, we have documentation in the archives about telling us what we can do to the paintings
Yeah.
and whatnot.
Our role is described for us.
Yeah, our role is described for us in the most general of ways.
Yeah.
And it's always somebody else's fault, or it's the environment. It's something, it's never his technique or anything like that. So, though he was very conscious of it, he approached preservation and conservation like an artist does,
Yeah, you in the blue sweater?
When you started out, you took over hundreds of abstract work, paper and oil and everything else. Had he specified the orientation for every piece that you took, or do you have sort of this two sides up question?
The question is, did Still specify the orientation of the abstract works? And no, not specifically. Signatures helped, as you might imagine, in terms of orientation. We generally knew there was a lifeline, so it was vertically oriented. That was the other side of it. So with those works that weren't signed, we figured we had a 50-50 shot half the time. And then sometimes we could go back to old images and identify it. I mean, interestingly, within the collection, we have works of some paintings, for example, where he signed the painting in the lower right and upside down in the upper left, because he himself didn't even know. So we
Or
have
changed his mind.
Yeah, or changed his mind. And we actually did an exhibition. Bailey Harburg-Platchik did an exhibition called Up Down, which basically explored that idea, because we have a number of duplicates within the collection where we've seen them oriented in both ways. And there's some, again, with some associated documentation that might have suggested one more than the other. But to your point, it's hard to say. I'll admit, being a newbie to the collection at the time, PH216, if you recall, which was the one that had the red form in the upper right corner, I remember looking at that going, this just doesn't look right. It looked better upside down. And so that's how actually I had it. That's how I hung it originally, was upside down. And then I finally discovered some historical images in the archives and realized that I was wrong. And hence we quickly changed the hanging hardware to the other side. But, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I know, that we have borrowed out of private collections, particularly for the show, but it happens often throughout the museum world that when they have a big important exhibition, they borrow privately owned artwork. What do private owners do about conserving their work? Do you get things that have really degraded because they've hung on somebody's wall for years and years in the same spot, or are people more careful about it when they own an important piece?
The question is about artworks in private collections and their potential, condition state, whether they're super degraded or not, or how those are taken care of, and then how private collectors seek the input from conservators and preservation specialists. I'm sure you've seen more stills in private collections than I have.
Yeah.
I've seen some.
Yeah, I mean, it really ranges. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it ranges on some ways on the sophistication of the collector.
Yep.
There are some that are very sophisticated and are very thoughtful about their collections and exposure, because in many cases they're understanding that light is potentially damaging to much of their collections, not just Clyfford Still works. So they're much more thoughtful around where they hang the works and how they light those works and overall exposures. That said, I've also seen collections. I saw a picture out of state. I flew down to Texas, and it was the most surreal picture of Clyfford Still I'd ever seen. It was originally one of the turkey red pictures, so that deep sort of blood type red color that had completely gone white because of extreme exposure. It was in a big contemporary home, and it was just getting blasted for years. And so, that red, it degrades from, the process is a slow process, and so you might not realize it until it's too late. But it starts out as this deep red, then it goes to a brown, and then goes to like a light cocoa color, and then it just goes white. So it was the weirdest thing looking at this picture, because the surface was absolutely pristine. No damage to it, except for there was no color. So it was a really sort of surreal experience as a picture. I wanted the museum to somehow acquire it just because it was just such a neat example, you know. But it really ranges. It really ranges. I think collectors are becoming more broadly are becoming more sophisticated around these issues of preservation and whatnot, which is really helpful. And they're also understanding that there's conservators in private practice and other folks out there that they can consult with around some of these issues, which is also very helpful. Yeah, in the red.
So, is there some place that somebody who is viewing this art can go to understand what you've done to restore or correct or do with each piece so that they can look at the piece in the light of that work?
You mean like a before and after?
Or, you know, a concurrent explanation of the restoration work you've done so that they can reflect on that?
Okay.
The question is, can a visitor to the institution, is there some place where they can find information about an artwork and its conservation history and, you know, maybe something about if it has been restored and to what extent or how? I think that that's a goal. That when we noted in the talk about being able to share with a broader community information about what we are doing, that I think that would be a component. It's not something that we're actively able to undertake at the moment, but we are beginning to look at those conversations and understand what those details are and how to best facilitate that. We do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a bit of a new practice. Historically, conservation records are absolutely not public access information. It is something that is held for, you know, collecting, for caretaking, for institutional information. There's a shift in that now. So it's something that we are exploring. It is something that we would like to share. We share right now in these kinds of platforms.
Yeah, there are some concerns around. We want to be as transparent around this
Yeah.
with this information as we possibly can, but in the name of providing context.
Yeah,
The problem is very often this information, because it's technical information or we're describing actions that we're undertaking on surfaces, often can get abused and utilized taken out of context and used in different ways, or taken out of context and in some cases used against the institution. So there are lots of other nuanced issues associated with revealing this information. Though I think the long-term goal of the institution is definitely to try to provide at least some limited access to it.
So it was referenced that painting you talked about in Texas, would you all be capable of replicating what that painting looked like originally and showing side by side?
Rothko style.
But-
The question is,
Yeah.
citing the Texas example, is that something that this institution could replicate or?
Well, I think when you say replicate, I'm sure we could create a facsimile of it, you know, to using the same materials that's still used in order to give a better indication in terms of what the picture originally looked like. I mean, with the full understanding, of course, that it is not original
Yeah.
in any way.
But it might also be something considered, like if you consider the Rothko murals and those new
Yeah.
treatment tools, you know, maybe it could simply be a light wash. You could hang it on the wall and it simply be a light wash again.
Yeah.
That would be, it's hard to say with certainty what's possible in those kinds of instances. They're very extreme.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about the shipping of those giant rolls. So shipping art is just a crazy process anyway, but I mean, rolls of a dozen paintings, like, were you worried that the shipping would damage them, like, while they're in the rolls, but like, was there a possibility that you take them out of the rolls before you ship them? Or was it always shipping these rolls,
Well,
hope that they don't get damaged from the
if you unrolled them, how would you ship them? I guess would be my question. Well, so the question is around shipping and if it was basically safer to ship the works rolled or otherwise. And I guess to my point is they were actually safer rolled for a few reasons. Number one, they were so tightly rolled that they weren't really moving. And number one, and if they had, some damage had already occurred, prior to that. Unrolling comes with its own hazards as well. And again, fortunately, within this collection, for example, again, most of the damage that's associated with the paintings collection has to do with paint that's still wet. Because the works stills technique was basically one where he stretched the canvases when they were dry, when the paint was dry to the touch, not dry to the touch. He would take them off the stretchers and roll them onto these tight tubes. So in some cases, that's why we have a lot of flattened textured areas, flattened impastoed areas in the paintings. We have a lot of cotton linters on the surface of the pictures. We have a lot of media bleed on the back of canvases, depending on the color. And in some cases, just paint stuck to the back. For example, I remember I was unrolling one, and it was a red painting, and the reds tend to dry a bit more slowly than the others. And I was literally pulling the canvas back, and the paint from the front of the canvas pulled away like chewing gum, because it was stuck to the back. And then, of course, we stopped, and then I jumped up on the table and sort of got a scalpel and released it from the back of the canvas. And it was still so elastic that it just conformed right back into shape. So we could have done that, but you're just introducing these risks, and then you have the problem of how you're going to ship them anyway. Because if you're going to talk about expenses of shipping, suddenly that means everything probably would have had to have been restrained in some way or stretched, and then that meant that everything would have to have an individual crate, which, costs upon costs upon costs upon costs. The feeling was like, let's just get everything here. The damage is what it is right now, and we'll address that as we go along.
Were they shipped vertically?
No, they were, I'm trying to remember, that was 10 years ago.
They were crated, right?
Yeah, they were crated.
Yeah.
Yeah, the rolls were all crated and shipped horizontally in multiple crates. So the question was how the rolls and all the works were shipped.
I think we have time for one more question. We've had a hand.
Way
Yeah.
in the back.
Thank you, sorry, thank you for your patience.
What makes his art so unique?
Okay, so the question is, what makes Clyfford Still's art so unique? Oh, that's a question and a half. How much time do you have? Okay, we got a lot of time. I think from the works on paper, there's so many things that make it unique. He works daily, and in the mid-40s, you watch him leave all materials except for what we can codify as a single set of oil pastels and construction paper in 2 sizes. That's all his materials in the works on paper are, after about the mid-40s, if I remember correctly. I think that's pretty unique, especially for somebody that dabbled, in painting on paper, making paint, and watercolors. He was very good in watercolor, in doing graphite drawings and pen and ink, even dabbled in printmaking, to leave all of the possibilities of the different materials behind and just devote a couple decades to one oil pastel set and some construction paper.
I think from the painting side of it, from a materials perspective, I always think of it as sort of the tension within Still of looking at the past and working in the future. So again, Still considered himself a traditional artist. He worked with traditional materials like oil paint on canvas, right? But, first off, he didn't prepare the canvases the same way as traditional. He left them bare, number one. So he used the canvas component as an aesthetic component and a working component within his works. He also used palette knives as his method of application, which was completely unique compared to traditionally using brushes or sometimes just squirting the paint on the surface and using the nozzle of the tube to manipulate the paint. And so you have this tension between traditional materials and sort of traditional gestures, but distilling those gestures to a point of abstraction using these techniques. So does that make sense in terms of that moving from past to the future, so to speak, in terms of trying to push painting in a new direction? Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That's all we have time for. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.